Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name, of course, is Seesaw or Chris, and today we're going to be talking about Guild Wars 2. Specifically, we're going to be talking about vertical gear progression in Guild Wars 2, and I know that's a very scary topic for Guild Wars 2. I'm sure there's even people who've seen the title of this video, the thumbnail of this video, and are coming here to tell me why would you even talk about this? Well, before you do that, please let me just explain what I think the problem is with the current gear system in Guild Wars 2 and what my suggestion is before you go ahead and say it's stupid. After I explain it, go ahead, give me your feedback. I do want to hear what people think about the system and what their suggestions are, but at least listen to it. So a basic outline of this video, I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can. I'm going to do it as one big take because I think that's going to help shorten it a little bit. It might get a little bit rambly, but I'll try and cut that out. And I'm also doing it in the morning, so my voice might be weird, but we'll deal with that. I don't know, maybe I dreamed about this last night, but I am inspired to make this video and finally put it out there. So let's talk about it. We're going to talk about the current gear progression system. We're going to talk about my suggestion, and then we're going to do a bit of a back and forth about the pros and cons. And let's just get right into it. So the current gear system in Guild Wars 2, for sure for the end game, can be looked at as 3 tiers of gear. The first of which is exotic. And if you're a new player to Guild Wars 2, don't be confused. There are lower tiers of gear in Guild Wars 2, such as green and blue, that you might use leveling, but in terms of end game, you're not really going to be looking at that very much. So with exotic gear, it's sort of the minimum amount of good stats that you can use for end-game gear. People will accept you into dungeons, low-level fractals. You can run raids with it. It's pretty decent gear. It's very accessible. You can buy it off the trading post. You can get it from lots of different content at in-game. It's pretty easy to get. The next step is ascended gear, and this is what I would call the soft cap of gear for Guild Wars 2. It's the maximum stats that you can acquire on each piece of gear, and it does give you agony infusions for raids, or for fractals, as well as infusions for damage and stuff for raids, and it's more difficult to acquire, but still not that difficult to acquire. A lot of people already have full ascended gear for most of their characters. As a new player, it definitely poses a bit of a challenge. I'd say probably within 2 to 3 months after hitting end game, the average player would get it. I mean, you could get it within a week if you were super about it, or it could take you much longer if you weren't super about it. So that's the second tier of gear at end level, and then the hard cap would be legendary gear, and this gear does not give any additional stats over ascended gear, but it does give cosmetic bonuses, as it looks badass, and it does give quality of life to the gear set. It allows you to switch stats and stuff like that, which is very good for Guild Wars 2, as there is a lot of reason to switch stats at different times. So that's the current system. Now you're probably wondering, great, what is the issue that you have of this system? Well, let's get to it. So the biggest one is my concern for the longevity of Guild Wars 2. As it is, I would say Guild Wars 2 is running out of ways to reward the top players of PvE content, specifically instance content. And I don't count myself as a top player necessarily. I have, a lot of ascended gear on all my characters, and I have a few pieces of legendary gear, but there are still pieces of legendary gear I could acquire. And more importantly, and this is my point, there are pieces of legendary gear for different gear categories that haven't been added to the game. For instance, we have recently gotten legendary trinkets, legendary back pieces and stuff like that, and they've very slowly been filling out that right side of your character screen where you have the 6 sort of rings and all that stuff. But at some point, they're going to fill out every single piece with a legendary item, and once they do that, people are going to have legendary gear in every single slot. And this might take a really long time. Don't get me wrong. This might even be over another full expansion. But at a certain point, it's going to happen. And at this point, there's going to be no real reason, except for cosmetic reasons, for someone to go for a new piece of gear. And this might not seem like a huge issue, but for sure for people like me, I don't know if cosmetic reasons is going to be absolutely enough. And that definitely puts some stress onto what ArenaNet could do after everyone has legendary gear in every single spot, or at least once a lot of the top guilds do. Now, an even bigger issue for me, and this is where I find myself, is once I have full ascended gear on at least my main characters, but a lot of guilds have ascended gear on every single character they play in raids. At that point, you feel soft capped and you don't really see any reason to get more gear because you're not getting any more stats. You don't care about the cosmetics or the quality of life that legendaries give, and you're like, well, I have all the gear. What am I going to do now? Because you're raiding, you're getting ascend gear, you're like, I have no one to put this on, so I'll stuff it in the bank, and it just never gets used. I think a lot of people are starting to find themselves in this kind of area, and this is really where I think we're starting to lose a few players in the raiding scene specifically, but at endgame and Guild Wars 2 in general. And I'm not entirely sure what Guild Wars 2 could do right away about this issue, unless they were to revise their gear system a bit. And that's what the next part of this video gets into. All right, so my suggested gearing system, and I'm gonna jump into it, so bear with me, is gonna do two big things. First, it's gonna unify and really combine the three big endgame PvE instant content that we have in Guild Wars 2. It's going to give a good flow to that content and make it seem like each one's building off of each other instead of just being isolated. And it's going to make gear progression between all of them make more sense and give a better flow pattern to both beginning level 80s as well as endgame level 80s that have been there for a while. So let's start with the very basic beginning of it, which is dungeons. I'm not actually suggesting we change too much about dungeons, but what I am suggesting is that we do add dungeons every expansion. And I'm not saying dungeons become like this next big new thing or whatever, but they add maybe one or two dungeons that would explore different regions of the new expansion. And I'm actually probably going to get a little bit of praise for that because a lot of people want new dungeons. But what I think they should do with the dungeons is really focus on being beginner friendly. So I'd say it's still the same difficulty as the old dungeons have, and focus on exploration, because that's the biggest thing that I think dungeons do pretty well, is they allow you to explore a big area, because they usually have different paths that interact with different NPCs, different local environments and stuff like that, and it would allow the devs to really dive deeper into certain elements of new maps. Specifically in Path of Fire, I can think of some great dungeon locations that allow us to explore maybe underneath various areas, various temples and stuff like that. There's so much they could do with that that I think they really should. Now, in terms of gear from it, I think exotic gear would still be dropped from dungeons, used in dungeons. There would be no requirement for ascended gear in dungeons, so I wouldn't change anything like that. The biggest thing I would change is that the rewards for dungeons would now be ascended gear. So currently you save up tokens to buy exotic gear in dungeons, but a lot of people already have exotic gear, so they kind of just use the tokens to make money, which is okay. But what I think would be cool is, maybe you save up a bit more tokens, but now those dungeon vendors sell the very basic tier of ascended gear with one agony infusion. And this is kind of how you gear yourself for the next tier of content, which is fractals. And I think this really gives a good place for dungeons, whereas right now it kind of lacks a place because a lot of people get to 80, they have full exotics, and they just really dive into either fractals or raids or open world to get some ascended gear and go into fractals or raids. A lot of people are able to skip dungeons, and if I had a new friend who was joining Guild Wars 2, in terms of trying to get to end game, like rating or whatever they want, like fractals, I wouldn't necessarily say, yeah, you should go do some dungeons to get better. I think that would be a slower way of progression. The only real reason you do it is if you want to make a bit of money that way, or if you want to experience the dungeons. And that's great, but I think if they have that content, they should be using it in a better way. So, like I was saying, I think they should have it so you can buy Ascended Gear with dungeon tokens. This would be the bottom tier of Ascended Gear with just one Agony Infusion. And I think what would be ideal is if they're going to continue to add dungeons in this new system, they make it so that every dungeon drops the same token. Or maybe like a certain amount of dungeons drop tokens for head pieces, a certain amount for shoulder pieces, or something like that. I haven't completely worked that out, but what I'm trying to look at is a way to make it so that all dungeons are played. Because if, I guess, all the dungeons drop the same token, people would just find whichever dungeon is the fastest and run that one all the time, which might be unavoidable as it is. But I think there could be a system that does allow players to play a bit more in terms of variety of dungeon. Maybe like every week there's a specific dungeon that gives like twice as many tokens and it sort of cycles through them or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. But the next phase of this new gear hierarchy is going to fractals. So you're leaving from dungeons, you have your first set of Ascended Gear with one Agony Infusion, and you're now able to do Fractals of the Mist with your one Agony Infusion. And I think they would beef up the lower levels of Fractal just to make it so you did need a bit of Agony Infusion, whereas now I think you can do like levels 1 to at least 1 to 10, maybe 1 to 20 without any Agony really, and there's not much issue. Just really make it so that you have to do a bit of dungeons before you jump into Fractals, I think. Now, Fractals is a very interesting thing because this is where the Agony originally comes from, right? And this was originally supposed to be the vertical gear progression in Guild Wars 2. And to some degree, it is still that because you do need to progress to get to the top amount of Agony to do level 100 Fractals. The weirdest thing for me, though, is that they made the limit 100 and they've kind of kept it that way for a really long time. I mean, it was 50 for a while, and then they reworked the fractals, which wasn't necessarily adding more. They were just sort of expanding and making duplicates to bring it up to 100 at around Heart of Thorns launch. And then when Path of Fire came out, they didn't really do much else to it. They just sort of sprinkled in some new fractals from time to time in between levels 100 and 1. And I found this very curious because when I initially heard of Fractals in the Mist and that it was going to be this continually scaling thing, I assumed that, you know, every so often they would push up the top level of Fractals, maybe like, you know, from 100 to 110 when they added a new Fractal of some sort, and then just keep on pushing it up that way. Or with the new expansions, they would have it so that every expansion adds 50 tiers of Fractals. So like Path of Fire would have added levels 100 to 150, which would have been a whole nother tier up or something like that. But that really hasn't happened. And it's curious to me because that's what I think should happen. And that's what I'm going to suggest in my system is that every expansion, they add sort of 50 tiers of fractals with some new fractals that are both, you know, historical fractals, but also fractals that are like sort of themed after the expansion. I think a lot of people are kind of like, why was there no Heart of Thorns really themed fractals? It would have been cool to have one that's like about the jungle, like way back when or something like that. I think that would have been very cool to see. We do see with Path of Fire that they did one about Joko, and I think that's excellent. If they had a few fractals that were like themed like that one was, that launched with an expansion, oh, that would have been such hype in such a way, the Sentinel expansion. Now, in terms of the actual gearing through fractals, I think you would use the tier 1 ascended gear with your 1 Agony Infusion that you got from dungeons. You'd use that to go from 1 to 50. And then you would start getting, like at the end of the 50s, well, throughout that, you would get rewarded tier 2 ascended gear, which would give you 2 Agony Infusions and would allow you to go into the next tier of fractals, which is tier 3, and would be from like 100 to 150. And this is where the Agony would continuously go up, and there would be new tiers every single expansion. And that's just how that system would always grow. Now, this also plays with the raid system, and this is kind of the biggest, I guess, change that I'm suggesting, is that raids now also use agony. And what this would look like is that, let's assume that each tier of raids is tied to its expansion. So wings 1 through 4 would be the Heart of Thorns raids, and they would be the first tier of raids. Wing 5 and whatever wings come afterwards would be tier 2 raids, and they would be associated with Path of Fire, and then tier 3 would be whatever, Cogs of War or whatever. And how this would work is that you would do the fractals, you would do the Heart of Thorns fractals, which was the tier 2. You would do those, and you would have the tier 2 ascended gear, and you would be able to start progressing through the tier 2 Heart of Thorns raids with that gear. This gear in the tier 2 Heart of Thorns raids would award you tier 3 ascended gear, which is what you would use to start progressing through fractals in Path of Fire, the next sort of content layer. Going through those fractals, you would get tier 4 ascended gear, which would allow you to then go through the Path of Fire raids tier. And then Path of Fire raids tier would start rewarding you gear to go through Cogs of Wars or whatever the new expansions fractals. So you would always be doing this sort of leapfrog from doing the new expansions set of fractals to the new expansion set of raids. And then once you had that maxed out, hopefully they're ready to release the next expansion, and you do the next expansion set of fractals and then the next expansion set of raids. So it would really play from progressing through 5-man content to progressing through 10-man content and back and forth. Now, I think that system would work really well. I'm throwing around the words tier, like ascended gear, and the amount of agony infusion slots per gear. I haven't completely worked that out. For instance, you don't want a tier, like, I don't know, if it continued like that forever, like a tier 6 gear with like 6 full-on slots of agony infusion. It probably looks pretty weird to see. I think at a certain point they could make like bigger infusion slots that just really condense the clutter on the gear or something like that. But I think this would be sorry about my voice. This would be a really good way to tie in all aspects of the game and make it work with a gear progression system very beautifully. And then dungeons would always, throughout each expansion, just be the way for new players to kind of jump into this tier system and sort of award them with the base amount of gear. So now that we've talked about that, let's just hop into some pros and cons. And this is really where I want you to share your feedback as well. Like, listen to some of the things I'm saying in case I'm going to say exactly what you're going to say, but then definitely pop some of your own feedback in the comments. So I'm going to start with the pros on my list, and then we'll sort of get into the cons at the end of the video, which I think will open a lot more room for discussion that way. But let's just jump in. So the first thing I have is with this new system, the highest level of agony and the highest tier of gear would always be pushed further up with each new content, each new expansion that comes, and there would continuously be new things for players to achieve. And this really addresses my main problem of the longevity of Guild Wars 2, where with their current system, I see a question mark in the distance where I don't know what they're going to do unless they're strictly going to reward mounts and chairs and stuff like that, which although might work for some players, strictly speaking for myself, that will not be enough of a reward. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, don't do the raids for the rewards, do it for the fun. But in terms of the world of MMO gaming, that has been proven to not be enough for a lot of players. And I think it's unreasonable for you to think that a game would succeed without giving some rewards for players that are more gear centric. A lot of people play MMOs to feel their character progress and get more powerful, not necessarily to have different chairs and stuff like that. And more to that point, I think the danger of doing pure cosmetic rewards is that at a certain point, they're going to create something that looks cooler than they can ever make again. And if they, the next reward for, I don't know, Wing 5 or for Wing 6 is a chair that's less cool than the Wing 4 or Wing 5 reward, people aren't going to be as encouraged to do that. And it's kind of a dangerous thing that way. We already see that with legendary armor, where a lot of people don't like the cosmetic look of it, and they're like, I don't care about this reward. And how long did they spend making that armor just for people to say, I don't care about it? So it's definitely a dangerous game as well. So the other thing, this makes gear progression important in raids, or in instance content anyways, but it doesn't apply to open world, which a lot of people who have issues with the gear treadmill are people who think they're going to be forced to do raids and stuff to keep up in open world. And the beauty of the agony system is that it only really applies to monsters that are dealing agony damage to you. So if the open world doesn't have any agony damage dealing out to you, which I don't suggest it does, this gear, like, even if you had the, theoretical tier 5 ascended gear, it would be no different in open world than someone who had tier 1 ascended gear or the current ascended gear. So I think it works really well that way. The other beautiful thing about this, about it being agony infusion, and I should have made this maybe clearer earlier on, the only thing that's going to get better with each tier of ascended gear is the added agony slots. The stats would remain completely the same. And because of that, there would also not be as much power creep. We wouldn't see people's DPS continue to skyrocket and skyrocket. We wouldn't see, first raids be completely trivialized, because although the agony resistance would remove the extra damage that agony does, it wouldn't change the DPS required to beat bosses. It wouldn't change a lot of mechanics that would wipe you. For instance, Sabbatha and her cannons that destroy the platform, that would still have nothing to do with agony, and lots of groups would still wipe because of that. The only thing that would, be reduced is maybe Sabbatha's actual damage that she deals to people periodically throughout the fight. Like, maybe if you step in the flak, you'd get a shit ton of agony on you, and you would die if you didn't have the gear. But apart from that, a lot of it would be different that way. So I think that really helps it a lot. In terms of cons of the armor, there's obviously some cons in terms of whereas right now I can sort of not raid, and I feel like I'm still at the current top level and can jump in at any time. If this system was implemented after 3 months or a year, and then if I came back to Guild Wars 2, I'd feel like I was behind. So that would definitely be kind of a negative, whereas a lot of people definitely like the idea of only casually playing Guild Wars 2 and raiding when they want. I think this would force a lot of people to have to put more time into the game. Opposite side of this is that currently I feel no reason to put time into the game, and because of that, I'm not playing. So it would help alleviate that, but might cause some issues for players that don't want to play as much as the gear treadmill, not as fast as the gear treadmill's running, if that makes sense. So I think some people might have issues with that, but I'm not entirely sure how that would go. And then the biggest issue that I see, and this is to do with a lot of gear hierarchies, gear treadmills. I know gear treadmill is such a nasty word, but it's definitely kind of what it is. It's the carrot on the stick that keeps people playing games, right? And although a lot of games and a lot of gamers don't like that idea, I think it's important for games to have this in the game to some degree. So the bigger issue that I see is that new players have a really tough time catching up to the top level players. And that's kind of what you see in a lot of games like World of Warcraft, where an expansion's been out for a year or something like that. And now you're looking at playing it and you're like, wow, it's going to take me a really long time to get to the top players, and I might never catch up, actually. And what those games do really well is they kind of reset it at every expansion. And although I think that's a decent system that Guild Wars 2 might be able to do, I don't really like it because it takes away a lot of the work that top level players did, except for cosmetic reward, which might be enough again. But what I think would be cool is just to have a limit as to how many tiers of gear are out there, or how many tiers there are between the lowest tier and the highest tier. For instance, as an example, if a new expansion is released, they would release a new tier of top gear for people to go and acquire. But what they should also do is up the tier of the lowest gear that people can acquire. So the gear that people are getting from dungeons, which was tier 1 gear, would then move to the tier 2 gear, and all the tiers in between would also scale up by 1 as well. And this would allow people to catch up, or for the distance between top and bottom to always remain the same. The other aspect of this is that in a regular game where stats would also increase and power creep would be crazy if you did this, this wouldn't have as much impact because it would just be the amount of agony infusions. And maybe they could do that for a while, and then after, at a certain expansion, they could reset the whole thing again. But I definitely think that that's a way they could deal with this. So this has been a really long video, and I kind of knew it was going to be. I really hope that it's understandable and that I did an okay job explaining it, because I know that it's really hard to explain systems without footage of the system, and I have no way. Like, I could draw crude pictures, but I think it would leave more questions than you would have this way. And speaking of questions, I think that's the important thing. I want, if you have questions about what I said, or just don't really understand anything, don't draw assumptions. Ask me in the comments. I'm going to be watching the comments of this video very closely, specifically for the first couple months after I launch it. So be sure to ask me, what I meant by this, or what I would do with this problem, because I really want us to flesh out the ideas of this and make something that could work. And then in addition to that, if you have any ideas of how you would handle this problem, I'd love to hear it. Or if you don't think it's a problem, let me know that too. I'd like to thank you all for watching this, and if you've made it to the end of the video, I am so happy with you. And if you like the content we do on this channel, be sure to drop us a like and subscribe. Until then, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.